Hi, we were wondering if you had some sort of business bakers special?
Come again?
See, we were roommates in pastry school.
We make pastries.
And now we're business bakers. And we just sort of wondered, like, do you have anything for that? A business bakers special?
We're shooting at Food 52 later.
Yeah, a video.
We don't have anything like that.
Hi, I'm Erin McDowell, and welcome to this very sweet episode of Bake It Up a Notch. This month, we are going to be talking about a subject that actually is not my strong suit. We're going to be talking about candy and confections. Now, because this isn't my strong suit, I wanted to bring in somebody who knows a lot more about it than me, my best friend, Evan. Come on in, Evan. Yay, welcome to Bake It Up a Notch. This is so great. This is one of the first times we've had a guest, so thank you so much for coming, and tell everybody what you do.
Hi, my name is Evan Coben. I am the owner and founder of Nikki Darling Confections in Chicago, Illinois, and I make all things sweet, just like Erin, but my sweets tend to be a little bit more sugar-based.
Yes, and this is an area that scares me a little bit, and actually, when we were in school, while we were both very good, diligent students, I would help Evan with some areas, pie crimping, and Evan would help me with some areas that I struggled with, chocolate tempering. Now today, I've just decided it's been too long. Evan is gonna teach me everything so that I can be at the level that I would like to be, and on the way, we're gonna teach all of you too. So it's just a reminder that not everyone knows how to do everything, but today we're gonna dive in and do a deep dive, Bake It Up a Notch style, on all the different kinds of candy and confections, and I'm so excited to get started.
I'm so happy to be here.
Anything else to add?
Oh, don't forget to like and subscribe.
That's right, so let's get baking. Oh, candying. So I think a lot of people get intimidated about the amount of equipment you need, but I think you're gonna be surprised that there's actually a lot of candy you can make with stuff you likely already have in your house. There's a few extra little things here too, so here's what we're gonna be using in today's episode. We've got a stand mixer, which we're mostly gonna be using with the whip attachment. We have a food processor. We have silicone heat-safe spatulas. We have foil cups, which are great for making peanut butter cups or all sorts of things. We have stainless steel bowls, which are Evan's favorite for working with chocolate especially, but also they're heat safe, so it makes it good for a lot of different candy projects. A scale is especially important in the candy making world because a little bit of extra can make a big difference. And then we have lots of things to kind of wrap and display our candies in. We've got lollipop sticks and little cellophane wrappers. We've got little cute boxes because Valentine's Day is coming up. But there's a few things that I think we should talk about a little bit more, like these frames. This is not something a normal person would have at home. Where do you get these?
So these stainless steel frames can be found at confectionery specific stores. You can also kind of use a hardware store hack for this.
Love that, we love a hardware store.
And these are fantastic to use for shaping your slabs of candy, but you can also use them for a variety of different things in different sizes.
But we did also test these recipes using a 9x9 pan and even just free form on a baking sheet. So it's not something you need, but if you make candy a lot, this is the kind of thing you'd probably want to invest in. Along that same line, we have lots of different molds here. And these are the kinds of molds, these are very inexpensive, and you see these a lot at craft stores, but I wanted to ask you, because I had to ask you this at my house the other day, why are some of them white and some of them are clear?
So the difference between these molds is really about temperature. The white molds tend to be really great for things like hard candies, things that are cooked to a much higher temperature. Otherwise, the clear molds are going to be a lot better for things like chocolate or marzipan molding.
It is really important because you could actually melt these if you weren't careful. So this one, the white one, is safe up to 375 degrees, which is going to be more than enough for the hard candy that we're cooking today. So just pay attention. Usually the molds say it kind of right in the packaging of their temperature sensitivity. And if you're really not sure, silicone is another safe way to go. These are at a lot of craft stores, really, really easy to get and come in a lot of fun shapes too. And they're really easy to unmold. We also have these special guys, which are dipping forks or spoons. These are specifically for dipping in chocolate, and we'll talk about that a little more later. And we have Your favorite thermometer.
My favorite thermometer.
This is Evan's favorite thermometer, but I need you to tell everyone why it's so great for candy making.
This is a wonderful thermometer to use for candy making because of the long probe that you can rest in your pot while you're cooking sugar. You can set your temperature to a specific temperature and then it has an alert. So you can kind of walk away, continue working on other aspects, and then as it beeps at you, you just run back over and you can continue with your work. This thermometer also goes up to a very high temperature, so it's really great to work with for hard candy and sugar syrups.
The most important thing to point out is that those candy thermometers that they sell in a lot of stores, we have a professional candy maker here. She says those aren't her favorite. No. So these are a little safer, you're a little less likely to burn yourself applying or attaching them, and they're easier to read to the exact degree.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I think now that we've gone over all the equipment, it's time to just dive in and
Let's
start
go.
making some sweets. First things first, let's talk about some of the ingredients, and let's start with sugar. Now sugar, that's the basis of like everything we're gonna make today, but there's a lot of different kinds of sugar, and there's also, I think, some misconceptions about some of the kinds of sugar that we use a lot in candy making. So let's start first with good old granulated sugar.
Absolutely.
Granulated sugar, which is the most common, versus something that we use a lot in the professional industry of invert sugar.
Right.
So what are the difference between these?
So granulated sugar here is going to want to stay in a granule. You can get granulated sugar that is either made from cane sugar or beet sugar. In most candy making applications, they will act the same, but this sugar will want to stay as a grain. So what we're working on is just trying to make it not that way. So we add other things like invert sugars or corn syrup or glucose syrup to help to facilitate this not staying as a granulated product.
Can you kind of define what that is for the folks at home?
So an invert sugar or liquid sugar is going to have additional acids and minerals in it that will help it to stay as a liquid form. You can always think of liquid sugars as anything that really is liquid at room temperature. And invert sugars can either be store-bought invert sugars, which will be listed as specifically invert sugar, or you can use natural ingredients like honey, molasses, maple syrup. These will also impart flavor, so you always want to balance that when you're working with an invert sugar. You can buy the store-bought invert sugar, which will have no natural flavor to it, or you can add delicious flavors like honey and molasses.
Yeah. One of the biggest things that I have a problem with, even though I haven't been the biggest candy maker in the world in the past, is that people at home have a real problem with corn syrup, okay? I have an article about this on Food 52 that I wrote years ago called "Corn Syrup is Not Evil," guys. It's not totally evil, but part of this is just understanding what corn syrup does. And also that the corn syrup you're buying in the grocery store is very different than high fructose corn syrup. That is a different situation, but corn syrup is really a powerful ingredient in candy making. And so we have to do just like a little bit of a plea to all of you that trust us, you're gonna wanna use the corn syrup, but why? What does corn syrup do? Like, how does it protect the things that we're making?
So corn syrup or glucose syrup will help to kind of insulate the granulated sugar and really break apart that crystal structure. So it's really important to be able to work with corn syrup. It's also going to work to kind of help you soften some of your other products. So when we make marzipan, nougat, or even soft caramels, you really want to use a soft liquid sugar like corn syrup or glucose. The difference between corn syrup and glucose syrup is that, well, one, glucose can be hard to find.
Yeah, unless you're a professional. A lot of professionals, or if you're in another country, elsewhere in the world, lots of people in other countries don't have access to corn syrup, and instead they might find glucose. But here in the States, it can be quite hard to walk into a grocery store and find glucose.
But you can often find corn syrup, and one of the big differences between those two products is really around moisture content. So somebody like me who makes candy professionally, I like to use a glucose syrup because it'll extend the shelf life of the candy that I'm making, whereas corn syrup might have a shorter shelf life. I'm not talking about something like 3 to 4 days versus 6 months. We're talking about the difference between a month and 3 months or 6 months. So corn syrup is a great product to use at home, especially if you're thinking about gift giving with your candy.
And I think that's one of the things that I think is the most important, is that corn syrup is sometimes listed as an ingredient in recipes in a pretty small quantity, and people might be tempted to leave it out. Just remember that it actually is there to sort of make the recipe easier. So if you see just a little bit in an ice cream recipe, it's there to help prevent ice crystals from forming. If you see a little bit of it in a candy recipe, it's just supposed to help give you that little extra bit so that hopefully it's not going to crystallize or give you any problems or grief later on in the process. Okay, so some recipes, in addition to just sugar, use other kinds of ingredients, and one of those, you kind of refer to it as doctors. What do you mean by that?
So a doctor is going to be an agent that is used to inhibit crystallization. So one of the things that we learned in school, kind of a slogan that works for almost every aspect of candy making, is time, temperature, and agitation promote crystallization. And so if you use a doctor, something like an invert sugar or cream of tartar, or even dairy ingredients, that will help to inhibit crystallization. So we work with cream of tartar often in recipes like hard candy, and then doctors like dairy in recipes like soft caramels, or even powdered dairy in nougat.
And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that's why some recipes tell you not to stir a sugar mixture because they don't want it to crystallize. But other recipes have a high ratio of these doctors in them, and that means you can stir them like a caramel and it's not going to actually cause it to crystallize because it's got these like lovely fat things coating it and all that jazz.
Absolutely. And sometimes also when you work with a doctor like dairy, it's very important to stir because you don't want dairy to burn.
Yeah, it can scorch on the bottom, and we're cooking things at high temperatures and for a long time. So all that's really important. Let's talk about some of your methods and pro tips for getting sugar right, because I'm not gonna lie, I usually just dump everything in the pot and kind of hope for the best. So you have like a method, right?
I do. I have a very specific method that I like to work with and that I teach everyone that I work with as well. So what I like to do is I layer my sugars, starting with your liquid sugar. So you're going to take your liquid sugar and add that to the pot first. This makes it so that your sugar is not in contact with the bottom of the pot. Your granulated sugar is not in contact with the bottom of the pot, which often will start to burn once you turn your pot on. So this gives you kind of a little bit of extra time to be able to work with your products. Say you forgot an ingredient, you've got to run to the sink to get some water, you'll be fine with that. So then next, you're going to go ahead and grab your granulated sugar and add that right on top of your liquid sugar.
And it's got that protective layer then at the bottom
Exactly.
of the liquid sugar, and then water on top.
And now we add the water on top so that you can kind of go through and liquefy or at least moisten all of the granulated sugar that's in here.
This is actually really mind-blowing for me because sometimes when I just pour the water in, there is like a clump of sugar that doesn't come into contact with anything. So this, now you can see it looks like all one thing.
It all looks like it's moistened, and you can pretty much see that there are no clumps of dry sugar in here. Clumps of dry sugar will make it really difficult for you to work with in the future as you're cooking your syrup. It'll also just kind of have the risk of burning, which you never really want. You always want to be able to control your sugars.
Once I put all my ingredients in the pot, I normally stir it off the heat, and you kind of told me yesterday that's not good.
It's not what we should do.
Okay, teach me how to do it.
So another reason why I love this specific thermometer with a long, thin probe like this is because it makes it so that you can't really agitate your sugar syrup all that much. If you only agitate it with a long, thin probe like this, or maybe the back of a wooden spoon, you really don't get a lot of power. And this makes it so that you can't put any additional sugar crystals on the side of the pot. Often we're taught if the sugar crystals climb up the side of the pot, you can wash them back down.
Yes.
All you're doing with that is adding more water, and you're slowing yourself down. You won't be able to kind of reach your temperature as quickly as you might like to. So this way, if you just stir with the long, thin probe or the back of a spoon, you'll have a much better time at not getting crystals up the side of the pot, and then you don't run the risk of crystallization.
And because the water's on top, that little bit of stirring, the water is like naturally washing the sides of the pot down a little.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you're really only stirring to kind of help like that early stage of dissolving the granulated sugar, right? That's all that's happening.
That's all that's happening. I'm only stirring so that you can kind of get everything a little bit more homogeneous. And at this point, I do not need to stir this at all anymore. So today we will be making a soft nougat. There is also something called like an old world nougat. Old world nougats tend to be a lot more chewy or even hard.
Oh, okay.
They often
like Torone maybe?
Exactly like that. Often old world nougats have a layer of like a wafer paper on the bottom and the top. You can find a lot of those in Italian specialty shops around the holidays, around the winter holidays specifically. But we're going to be making a soft nougat, which is a lot more popular for chocolate dipping here in the US.
It's inside, we can't maybe say the names, but it's inside many of your favorite candy bars, okay? Soft nougat. Let's make it.
So we're going to start with our sugar syrup. So this is a sugar syrup that has corn syrup, granulated sugar, and water. We've layered it in the way that we recommend, and we have our thermometer just kind of hanging out in here. One of the caveats for these thermometers is if it is touching the bottom of the pot, it will read incorrectly. So you always want to make sure that you're holding it or it's resting so that it's slightly hovering within the pot.
You know what I use for this? Those binder clips.
Perfect.
If you can get a metal binder clip, make sure it's all metal because if it's plastic, that's not gonna work.
Nudge.
And you can actually just clip it to the side of your pot and weave your thermometer probe right through it, and it's not gonna touch the bottom.
Those are perfect, absolutely perfect. Then what we're going to do is we will sift together a powdered milk and powdered sugar here. And so these ingredients will be used to shorten the texture of the nougat. If we don't shorten nougat, we end up with marshmallow, which is also delicious.
Yum. Evan is a marshmallow expert.
But it's very important to shorten your nougat. And shortening, think of something, the texture more similar to like a shortbread cookie, right? It's going to be a little soft, but also kind of have a bit of a break to it.
Yeah, we want when we bite into it, we are not looking for that pull of something like taffy. You know, it's gonna be more like when you bite into it, it breaks away, you know, like a candy bar or a little chocolate covered something.
So these two ingredients will just be sifted together and kind of set aside for us so that they can be folded into the nougat when it comes off of the KitchenAid. We just wanna make sure that there are no lumps or clumps and that everything is well incorporated.
Then we've got our other kind of section. While our sugar is cooking, we can still get this ready. I'll help.
Okay.
So we've got egg whites, right?
Yes, we've got egg whites here. We also have a little bit of corn syrup. This will help as we're whipping our egg whites before we pour in our cooked sugar syrup so that the egg whites don't over whip. This helps us a lot here.
See, corn syrup, it's not
So
evil,
great.
guys. It helps us in so many ways.
So many ways. And then finally, we have our flavoring agent. Erin and I both love vanilla bean. And so we're gonna use some vanilla bean paste for our vanilla bean nougat. I like to say that vanilla is one of those ingredients that you can kind of measure with your heart. Just use as much as you think your soul is moving you to use.
We've got our whip attachment here, and we won't start whipping it until it is closer to our temperature, correct?
Right. So we don't want to over whip our whites. So we won't start whipping until our candy syrup, our sugar syrup, reaches 230 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, we can start whipping our egg white mixture. This will make sure that we don't over whip the whites and that we have nice, consistent, well-whipped whites when we're ready to pour in our syrup.
We would be remiss while we're talking about aerated confections if we didn't spend a little bit more time on marshmallows. I have a great marshmallow recipe here on the website at Food 52, but no one knows marshmallows like Evan. So you mentioned that there are kind of different varieties of marshmallows. How do you classify them?
So there are different varieties of marshmallows. You can find either, I like to think of them as American marshmallows or French marshmallows. An American marshmallow is not going to have egg whites in it, whereas a French marshmallow will. Okay. So a French marshmallow with egg whites will not last as long because you do have those fresh egg whites in there. Often those types of marshmallows are really great as toppings on pie, on as fillings in all sorts of different cakes and confections. They can be cooked a little bit softer. When you're doing an American style marshmallow, they tend to be just made with gelatin. And so they can be a bit more firm. Also, in that textural difference, you can play with the amount of gelatin that you use and the temperature that you cook your sugar to, so that it can be a little bit more pipeable. So you can pipe them into hearts, kisses, little chicks, all sorts of things depending on your...
I did ghosts at Halloween.
Oh yes, ghosts at Halloween are cute.
And you know, I think the main thing that's interesting, like I use when I'm making pies, I use a lot of times the egg white style marshmallow, but that's because I used egg yolks in the baking. So it's kind of, when you're trying to decide which way to go, it depends a little bit just even on what you've got around. Both are delicious, both are fluffy, and I might just eat one right now. Don't leave me with a pot of sugar. If I watch a pot of sugar boil, I will find a marshmallow to eat while I do it. Later we'll have another one, we'll toast it. When we eat too many marshmallows, Evan calls it marshmallow heart. You can feel it right in the center.
They start to solidify right around the middle of the chest.
This is not an actual medical condition. Okay, so when the sugar syrup reaches 230 degrees Fahrenheit, then it's time to turn on our mixer. We're gonna start whipping our egg whites with the corn syrup and vanilla paste inside. The egg whites are gonna keep whipping. That corn syrup is gonna prevent them from getting over whipped or dried out. And we'll keep cooking the sugar syrup to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it's time to stream it into the mixer. I think actually we can just go ahead and do it.
Yep, so now that we've come to temperature, 250 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to stream our hot sugar into our egg whites. And you want the egg whites whipping consistently at a high heat so that it doesn't scramble the egg whites.
But it may seem kind of scary to add a hot syrup with the mixer running, but because of the volume of what else is in there, it's not gonna splash up at you as long as you add it in a slow, steady stream. And of course, be careful. You are dealing with hot sugar. Anytime you're making candy, some level of being careful is important.
Now we will let this whip for a total of 8 minutes.
So it's more aerated now. Oh my gosh, look how thick it is. But it
it's
still
a little
has
stringy, taffy-like.
Falling off the whisk a little bit.
Right.
So this is now when we're gonna add that dry milk and the confectioner's sugar. And the dry milk is what gives nougat that like creaminess, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah, you can get some creaminess from the dry milk, the powdered sugar, and this will help. As I said before, these are the shortening ingredients. So we just wanna add these in after your nougat syrup, your nougat mixture has fully whipped, and we're going to fold these in.
That always makes me think of Schitt's Creek now when
folding it in.
Yeah.
And how do you fold the cheese?
We have talked about folding many times on Bake It Up a Notch so that you don't have a David moment in your own kitchen.
So now I'm just going to pour this out onto our greased parchment paper, our sprayed parchment paper. And oh, thank you for the assist. So we're just going to put this out. This is a moment when you could go ahead and use the candy frame, but we're going to just sort of free form lay this out. As we know, not everyone will have a candy frame.
One of the things we're just hoping to do in this episode is show you that even if you don't have all the perfect equipment, it shouldn't stop you. Like, we wanna not have any fear about candy making. Some of these recipes, they really do hold for a long time in your house. So this is like a one special project day that then you can be enjoying for a really long time and gifting to people. And
yes, for sure. You can use this in a variety of different ways. What I like to do also to smooth out my nougat is I just get a little of that neutral oil nonstick spray onto my hands, and the candy will be warm. It's not unbearably warm or really hot, it's just warm. And so you can kind of coax it now with your hands into whatever shape you want to work with it. So if you want it to be a little bit thinner or a little bit thicker, you can go ahead and pat it out like this. Very similar to like shaping and squaring up pie doughs. And at this point, you could use an offset or a bench scraper
to kind of straighten up the edges.
Straighten your edges.
We've demoed that on Bake It Up a Notch before as well when we did puff pastry. Sometimes I bring in my little tool here, my bench scraper, to help force the shape to have corners and straight edges.
This is a great time to really say, as I'm going to use this, maybe I'll be layering it with a caramel or a jam, dipping it in chocolate, and I don't want something that's gonna be this big to bite into.
Or maybe you do, you know? I mean, that's the thing. When you make it at home, you can do it however you want.
However you like.
I'm pretty sure I have nougat on my nose.
No, you're good.
Okay. And how long would this need to set before it'd be ready to be sliced?
So to cut into your nougat, you wanna give it at least 4 to 6 hours, ideally overnight. The longer you let your nougat sit, the more it will shorten. So as it ages over the course of time, it will kind of create a crystal structure, that shortening structure, where you'll have a slightly different nougat. So the nougat that you eat tonight, or the nougat that comes off of your spatula that we've been eating now, is a little bit chewier than it will be tomorrow, and even more so than it could be even next week. So you can kind of play around with how much shortening ingredient you add into your nougat to get the exact texture that you'd like.
We have done this on a piece of marble just to keep it as flat as possible, but you could also use your flattest sheet tray or even turn your sheet tray over, because sometimes the back of the sheet tray is a little flatter.
A wooden cutting board, a plastic cutting board.
Absolutely. We're gonna let this set. We have some, of course, that we made yesterday that's already set. Later, we're gonna dip it in chocolate. But let's make some other sugar-based confections first. Next, we're gonna talk some about caramel sauce, which will give us an opportunity to talk about some of the important things of caramel and how that's different from regular sugar cookery. And we're gonna use it later to make caramel cups. So what are you doing first, Evan?
So right now I am doing what is often called a dry caramel or a French caramel. This is where you caramelize your sugars first. So I have a little bit of corn syrup and granulated sugar in this pot. I'm cooking it over pretty high heat, and I'm doing something that everyone would tell you not to do, but I am telling you it's okay to do in this instance. So I am stirring this granulated sugar, even though the granulated sugar is not fully melted. And the reason I'm doing this is because it doesn't really matter in this application.
Wait, we need to break this down a tiny bit more, because in school and in a lot of classic pastry books, they teach you to make this method of caramel by just sprinkling a small amount of sugar into the pan, letting it dissolve and melt, and then sprinkling more and adding a little at a time, a little at a time. But especially if you have an uneven stove top, maybe you're not using the best pan, this can be a real recipe for burning in some spots. And I always struggle with this for that reason. In fact, if it was not for Evan showing me this, I do not make dry caramel anymore because I have messed up many a dry caramel. But the point is that if you're stirring it just to coax it into melting, and then once it's melted, you stop, it's going to survive this process. And caramel in general is a lot more flexible than I think people realize. People get scared of it, right?
Absolutely. It's one of those things that as I'm stirring, I'm keeping an eye on any of these little clumps of sugar. If the sugar is kind of clumpy when it goes into the pot, that's okay. You can break it apart with the spatula. On the spatula, you see that I've got some clumps. I'm gonna press those onto the bottom of the pot and try to get those to melt and dissolve down. Because I'm going to be adding cream and butter to this sugar syrup, I know that I'll be able to kind of dissolve any remaining sugar crystals that are in the pot. This is also a moment where you can really pick and choose exactly how dark you want your caramel.
It's really important because you're noticing we're not actually using our thermometer here. We're just eyeballing it for the right consistency and color. And once it starts to caramelize, it does go quickly, especially if you're working with, did you get a little steam bath there? This we call these, confectioner's facials. You're getting, so she's adding now, ooh, yes. She's adding the cream, which is going to both stop the cooking process and make the caramel kind of stop where we want it. But in addition, it's also going to bubble up a lot. This is something that just happens. Don't think you did anything wrong. Whenever you add the dairy product at the end of a caramel, it is going to massively bubble up. And that's important to think about when you're choosing the pan and pot you're gonna use. Make sure you don't choose something really tiny. It's going to be more prone to bubbling over. When it does that bubbling up, sometimes that can cause the caramel to kind of seize.
Right, so if it starts to seize, don't worry. keep going. You can put the pot back onto a little bit of low heat as well to dissolve any remaining sugar crystals or lumps of seized caramel, and that will be absolutely fine. Just a really low heat so that you don't continue to cook the caramel in any way or make it a little bit more firm. Hey, do you say caramel or caramel?
So it kind of depends on what I'm talking about.
I say caramel.
I say caramel most of the time, but every now and then I'll be like, I need a caramel ice cream sundae.
Oh.
Like, I don't know, just with some things it feels like caramel is right. I don't know. But that's one thing. I asked Evan this question because I've never been able to, in one of my recipes, list a temperature. The same way in all these other recipes, we're like, cook it to 240 on the dot, cook it to 230 on the dot. You can't really list a temperature for caramel because also there's a lot of acceptable ranges of caramel. These are both caramel sauces we made yesterday, and you can kind of see in our overhead camera that one is a little bit darker than the other, and it's the same recipe, it's just one was cooked a little bit less. And actually that's the same for some of Evan's candies that she makes. These are her vanilla bean caramels, and you can see how like blonde and light they are because this is a really mild caramel, really creamy and buttery. So, you know, when it comes to caramel, it's definitely a spectrum, and we love all of the spectrum of caramel here at Bake It Up a Notch. We like light caramel, we like dark caramel. But what's important to know flavor-wise if people want to go light or dark?
So if you go a little bit lighter, you will have a more blonde, sweeter flavor. You'll taste more of those dairy notes, some of the butter notes, some of the flavoring agents like the salt or the vanilla could come through and really sing. If you have the darker caramel, you'll have something a little bit more bitter. So if you prefer something a bit more bitter, then you can take the caramel a little bit further.
Vanilla and salt after the cream and butter, and that's pretty much it.
And that's it. And again, I've kind of seasoned this caramel with my heart. So feel free to jazz bake your seasoning there.
Yes. And now we need to let this cool because we're gonna use it to make caramel cups later. It has to be completely cool, otherwise it's gonna melt our chocolate. So we're gonna set this aside to cool and come back when it's ready. That was weird. Next up is marzipan. And I think marzipan is really misunderstood. Like, there's lots of things we have to say about marzipan. I'm getting excited, I'm getting ahead of myself. But we can talk about some of it while these nuts are cooking.
Yes.
So let's get those in first
Yes.
and we'll tell everyone why we love marzipan so much.
So we're going to make a toasted hazelnut marzipan. So we've got blanched and toasted hazelnuts and almonds going into the boiling water. You're going to cook them once the water comes back up to a boil for about 5 minutes. This is going to soften the nuts. It'll make it easier to process and also kind of bring out some of those flavors. So that's gonna sit for 5 minutes.
And just to cover the absolute basics here, blanched nuts are nuts that have the skins removed. It can be pretty difficult to find blanched hazelnuts out in the world. So to blanch hazelnuts, you just need to bring them, boil them in boiling water. You can use a clean kitchen towel to help you loosen the skins after you've boiled them. But it's easier to find blanched almonds and other things. And that's really one of the things I wanted to talk about with marzipan, because in pastry school, in our confections class, this was a real eye-opener for me. Because I didn't really realize that you could make marzipan with anything other than almonds, which maybe sounds silly now, but you can make it with pistachios, you can make it with pecans, walnuts, cashews.
You can even add in additional ingredients like wine, spices, absolutely delicious. The marzipan is, I think so many people expect marzipan to just taste like almond extract.
Yeah.
Which I have a personal
She does not like almond extract.
Against almond extract, so I never really enjoyed store-bought marzipan. And then in pastry school, when I realized that you could make it without almond extract, oh my God, light bulb, this stuff is delicious.
And it's really one of the easier confections to make in a lot of ways. It does involve a little bit of sugar cooking, but nothing you can't handle. We've already gone over the layering in the pot. Yeah. You've got your good thermometer now. So if you can do that, you can definitely do this. And the cool thing about it also is it has a very long shelf life. So this is gonna make a decent number of pieces and you can be munching on them, gifting them, enjoying them for a really long time. So once we get those soft, we'll drain them and we're gonna grind them just enough to chop them up. We don't need to get them super duper fine at this first stage. We just wanna chop them up because we're gonna coat them in the sugar syrup when it gets to the right temperature, correct?
Absolutely, that's exactly what we're going to be doing.
Cool. So the nuts are nice and soft now. We're just gonna drain them. Once they're well drained, we can grind them in the food processor just till they get to that chopped consistency. And I did mention this already, but we did toast these nuts after blanching. That is really important with the marzipan just because it's gonna improve the flavor so much. So I actually even took it to a pretty decent level of toastage. Okay, I'm gonna switch places with you once you get those drained and you can grind these up, and I'm just gonna check our sugar syrup.
Perfect. Swap.
Swap. This is actually one of the hardest parts of my job is using appliances backwards.
My God. All right, so these are just roughly chopped, which is great. That's exactly what we want. And then we're going to put them into a stainless steel bowl. And once the sugar syrup comes to temperature, you will be mixing the sugar syrup into the nuts in this bowl. Now that our sugar syrup has come to temperature, we're going to pour it over the chopped nuts. Yeah, pour it over.
And why is it okay at this point to be stirring when you kind of in general don't want to stir sugar syrups?
So now that your sugar syrup is off the heat and we're mixing it into these rather large clumps, we don't really run the risk of crystallization nearly as much as if we were to stir the sugar syrup on the stove.
Okay, great. So just don't be afraid once a recipe says to stir it, trust the recipe. Like a good recipe is going to say, don't stir it at this stage and stir it at this stage. And so when it comes to sugar, just keep that in mind as you're working with it. Okay, we've got beautiful, syrupy,
chopped nuts.
I'm just gonna spread that into an even layer. So we'll take a little break, let it cool to room temperature, then we're gonna grind it until it is beautiful and smooth and marzipan-y. Josh is just gonna have to cut through so much of us giggling. Sorry.
It's also going
We're building suspense.
Sorry.
The nuts have cooled. The syrupy nuts have cooled. Marzipan. Our candied nuts have cooled, so now we need to grind them up into the marzipan. And when I was learning to make this, I asked Evan, so I just put it all in the mixer, in the food processor, and she said, no, you really need to do it in batches. And I think that's especially important for people at home because we don't want to kill our food processor, right?
Your food processor is your friend, and you really don't want to get rid of her.
This is not an episode of Cooking with Paris.
No.
Love you though, Paris. But we're not gonna bring any appliances today.
No appliances. So we're going to combine our ingredients in the food processor into 2 portions. In this instance, this will allow you to kind of run your food processor. It may get a little bit warm. Do not be alarmed. It's what it's meant to do. Periodically, you will come over and scrape down the food processor. It's going to become a very smooth and fine nut paste, which is really all that marzipan is.
Cool, so I'm just gonna go ahead and start this, turning it on, and it can take up to 10 minutes or so to get as smooth as we need it. So here we go. No, it's
not
back.
plugged
in. No, it's on backwards.
No, it's not plugged in.
Oh.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay, it's plugged in now.
Nailed it.
So the marzipan has been running and it is now finished. You can see that the marzipan is kind of balled up into one area of the food processor. It's a little tacky, kind of sticks to the finger if you let your finger sit on it, but you can also remove your thumb and your fingers pretty easily. This looks perfect. We are now smooth and delicious hazelnut marzipan. So now that you have your finished marzipan, you can do all sorts of things with it. You can press it out into a 9x9 pan like we did yesterday. You want to grease your 9x9, you can use your frames and press it out into any sort of shape, as well as to place it into some molds. So you can grease the molds and use it to make sweet little shapes like this that can later be dipped in chocolate. You can put it on a little popsicle stick or a lollipop stick rather, and press it out into any little shape there as well.
Now that our marzipan is pressed into its shape, we can let it set for a little bit. How long would you say? A couple hours?
A couple hours.
And then it's gonna be ready to slice. So I think we'll set these aside for a little bit, then we'll slice them and we're gonna dip them in chocolate later.